Tilda, I'd like to take a moment, if I may, to introduce you to one of feminism's many rabbit holes. This one in particular comes from a live stream I did on Honey Badger Radio not all that long ago. Specifically on the Bunny and Doe Show episode 4, Sexist Men Be Crazy. And on that stream, we looked at an article from the Washington Post entitled Sexist Men Have Psychological Problems, and that article was reporting on a particular meta-analysis, which was looking at asserted masculine norms and how some of them can be damaging. Long story short, the article was a very poor misrepresentation of what the study was actually saying. What was quite interesting about this particular study was how it came to our attention. And I'll give you the first couple of minutes of that live stream so that it can be explained to you. Because I just showed up to look at the paper. I had nothing to do with actually finding it. And this way the words come from the person who actually found it, so I'm not going to be making any mistakes in telling you what happened. So yay, it's time for an origin story movie.
Okay, so the way I came across this was I was invited to a Facebook group called Against the Odds, YouTubers Working Together for Men. The group was put together by Chrisiosity. Chrisiosity is a YouTuber that appeared on the, you might remember her from the Questions for Anti-SJWs. Her profile picture is a Liechtenstein painting, and Christy Winters was also in that video. Christy Winters is part of this group, and she posted because she is doing research for some video dealing with men's issues. But Christy often comes at this topic from a, feminist version of men's issues perspective, which involves, toxic masculinity, it's men's fault, and so on. So this is what she wrote when she posted it. Posting because this article deals with men's mental health, an issue this group is committed to working on, right? Please don't shoot the messenger, me, because of the meta-analysis results of the study's finding. So when I saw it, I thought, well, let me take a look at this article because it was entitled Sexist Men Have Psychological Problems. And I thought, well, since Christy Winters is always asking us to do more robust analyses of feminist work, why don't we do something that she claims is good enough or robust enough to use? So that's how we came across this.
Okay, so that's the important backstory out of the way. This study is being pointed to by the various feminists on the interwebs as being a particularly robust piece, presenting very good data in a particularly reliable fashion. Unsurprisingly, in that live stream, Brian, Bunny, and myself disagreed. And one part of our disagreement came from the inventory that the researchers were using to code masculinity. They were using a scale which they call the Conformity to Masculine Norms Inventory, which is an inventory of 11 distinct factors, which are winning, emotional control, risk-taking, violence, dominance, playboy, self-reliance, primacy of work, power over women, disdain for homosexuals, and pursuit of status. Now, at the time in that livestream, we did note that some of those traits seemed a little bit odd, to say the least. And there were a lot of questions raised about how exactly some of these terms have been developed and defined. For instance, risk-taking behavior as being something masculine. Now, it was posited in the livestream that drinking to excess is a risk-taking behavior, and that is a behavior that we see women engaging in, as well as men. The disdain for homosexuality was also something that was questioned. There have been societies where pedestry has been normalized, and there are some practices which exist even to this day which can definitely be considered pretty damn gay, which are actually rites of passage into manhood. One example that immediately springs to mind was an example that I found while researching the video Oxford Doesn't Understand Genital Mutilation, a video in which I looked at various genital cutting rituals from all around the world. And one of the examples in that video comes from Australia and its Aboriginal cultures, wherein the men would bifurcate their genitals. That is, the length of their penis would basically be split in two. And there is a ritual in some of those cultures, which while reading about it seems to continue to this day, wherein a young boy is made to place his erect penis in between the bifurcation of an older man's genitals and rub back and forth, that is, basically have penile sex with each other until they ejaculate, and that this is considered a rite of passage. Now, that practice is very homosexual. It's two guys using their genitals to stimulate each other until they ejaculate, and yet that's considered fairly normal and masculine to do. So with things like this being known, the CMNI being used in this research seems to have been developed from a very Eurocentric point of view. Now, that doesn't make it inherently wrong, but it does very distinctly bias the results when you're attempting to claim that these are masculine traits, as in something that universally men display. And these are just a few points which came up during the stream, and that I've had a bit of time to dwell upon afterwards, but going forward, I was quite interested in where this conformity to masculine norms inventory came from, and how it was actually developed, because it seems to be nothing more than the author's assertion of what they consider masculine behavior to be. So I went digging through the citations of the paper, and I've found what I believe to be the origin of the conformity to masculine norms inventory, and it appears to be a paper titled The Development of the Conformity to Masculine Norms Inventory. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that this is where it came from. And I read through this paper, and I have found what I consider to be several issues with this particular inventory. And frankly, I would consider some of these problems to be so large that they invalidate this as a legitimate model to use in any sort of analysis. So I'd like to go through this and share some of those with you. So the paper does have an introduction where it just talks about the idea of social norms and rules, and how there are basically socially agreed upon ideas and concepts about how people should behave. Because yes, there are standards that people have, and there are generally accepted ones and generally frowned upon ones, and that's completely reasonable. Obviously, the introduction does go on to talk about why they want to develop a scale, and it mentions some of the other studies that they read before getting to this point. It's a fairly standard introduction. It just outlines the thought process in getting up to the point where the author then says, I propose constructing the CMNI to explain these patterns of behavior, and to further expand on the research of others and yada yada yada. Again, it's pretty standard stuff. The point which I'm most interested in is then the section which is actually talking about the construction of the CMNI. So we're going to read through that, and then I'm going to point out what I consider to be the pretty major flaws in this. Construction of the CMNI. The inventory was constructed to assess the extent that an individual male conforms or does not conform to the actions, thoughts, and feelings that reflect masculine norms in the dominant culture in the US society. So I'm glad that in this paper they are specifically stating that this is to do with the US. So it's only trying to assess one specific cultural profile of masculinity, not just all men's behavior in general. So that's nice that they've cleared that up. This construct was chosen because Mahalik 2000 posited that gender role norms from the most dominant or powerful group in a society affect the experiences of persons in that group as well as persons in all other groups. Thus, the expectations of masculinity as constructed by Caucasian middle and upper class heterosexuals should affect members of that group and every other male in US society who is held up to those standards and experiences acceptance or rejection from the majority in part based on adherence to the powerful group's masculinity norms. So this is where my first objection to this begins. The assumption here, and that's all it is because, as this paper says, it is posited that this happens. It hasn't been demonstrated, it's merely asserted, that masculinity is being defined by a small group of middle and upper class heterosexual white males. Sounds a little bit like the feminist patriarchy assertion, but I'll give them the benefit of the doubt here. Now, this assertion that this author makes here I think misses out a very fundamental piece of the puzzle, and that is the influence that women have on the behavior of men. Anyone who has studied biology or animal behavior to pretty much any level should be aware of the basic process of survival of the fittest. The idea that whatever animal is suited best to its particular environment is more likely to pass on its genes than those which are less well suited, and that this is a constant competition within a species for that individual to basically mate and pass on their genes. Now, survival of the fittest is only a part of the equation that is reproduction. Another part, which this author seems to have neglected, is the concept of sexual selection, sometimes referred to as the Fisherian runway or runway selection. And this is another factor in reproduction and animal behavior which seems to be somewhat at odds with survival of the fittest, but is actually just another part of the equation. A perfect example of this, and probably the most used because it's really obvious, is the peacock. The peacock's tail is in no way survival of the fittest. This massive display tail actually prevents males from reaching peak optimum fitness. It is a massive calorie investment for the male, and the result of owning such a massive ornate behind is that the males then have a reduced ability to fly and maneuver in the air. It makes running more awkward for them, it makes hiding from predators more awkward, not only because they are garishly coloured and stand out like a sore thumb in pretty much any environment, but they're also incapable of hiding in small places. This tail should be evolutionary suicide, and yet it isn't. Why? The answer is sexual selection. Peahens find these large ornate tails to be extremely attractive. And the reason for this is because they are a display of strength. It's basically a signal saying, look at me, I can succeed despite this massive handicap. I can acquire all the territory and food necessary to grow the thing in the first place, and despite the fact that I can't fly as well as other males, despite the fact that I can't run as far or as fast and juke and jive like they can, I'm still here. So this intentional disability, this intentional handicap that these males are giving themselves is actually then the sign of their fitness. It's very counterintuitive, but this gives you an idea of the importance of sexual selection. So why am I talking about peacocks and comparing it to a paper about humans? Well, the answer is because there is a similar pattern of behavior observable in people. Now, the human mating game is considerably more complex than that of the peacock, but the same strategy is deployed in humans to some degree. It's a pattern of sexual signaling, and to explain this in a far more succinct way than I ever could, I'm going to briefly cede the floor to Dr. Gad Saad, Professor of Marketing and Consumption Behavior, and holder of the Concordia University Research Chair in Evolutionary Behavioral Sciences and Darwinian Consumption, because he just might know a thing or two about this.
Rappers are an excellent demonstration of this type of sexual signaling. If you look at every rap video, there's always roughly the same theme. There's one or more male rappers either demonstrating that they have a whole bunch of high luxury items in front of them, fancy cars, fancy yachts, and they're always throwing money from the window, from the Ferrari, and so on. That throwing of the money is a type of signal called costly signaling in biology, right? So the peacock, in order to demonstrate that he's really fit, has to have a very burdensome tail so that the ladies can say, boy, this guy must really have good genes to be able to support such a costly tail. Same principle when it comes to throwing money away. Boy, I must be really rich as a rapper to be able to, in a very cavalier manner, throw away thousands of dollars from the balcony or the Ferrari. Same principle, different context.
Now, while rapping and hip-hop culture might be an extreme example of this particular kind of behavior, it is something that all men engage in to some degree. Indeed, this is why the entire economic principle of Veblen goods exists. Veblen goods are part of a pattern of conspicuous consumption. Basically, it's buying things which are intentionally overpriced for their function. Things which are needlessly fancy, basically. So you could make clothes by sewing two rectangles of cloth together, and cutting out leg, arms, and a head hole. Basically, walk around wearing an onion sack. That's pretty much as simple as it gets. Or you can go further than that. You can shape and craft your garments, or even better, have someone else do it for you. And the more and more elaborate and costly these things are, the more that is associated with your social status. And this is a behavior that all humans engage in. Same thing applies to things like jewelry, expensive luxury wines, so on and so forth. And this is again all part of that status signaling, which is a part of sexual signaling. Women engage in these behaviors to get the acceptance and admiration of men and other women, and men engage in those behaviors for the same reasons, to get admiration and attention from women, and again, the admiration of men. So to finally bring us back around to this paper, I find it really odd that this author is just asserting that middle and upper class men control the behavior of everyone. It completely removes from the equation the influence that women have on that process. And to this author, I would posit that actually women have more influence on this process than men do. Because when you consider these sorts of behaviors in animals, it is always the female that is the determining factor in what is acceptable. The males just ply themselves to what the female demands. So I find the exclusion of all female agency in this to be a little bit weird, since it flies in the face of everything we know about animal behavior. Back on to the actual study. The first step in constructing the measure was to identify masculinity norms in the dominant culture. To do so, we reviewed the literature on traditional masculine norms in the United States. So they did a bit of background reading from all of these sources, completely normal. Now comes the big part. Next, 2 focus groups consisting of both men and women who were master's and doctoral students in counseling psychology. Group 1 consisting of 1 Asian American man, 1 European American man, and 2 European American women. That's 4 people. Group 2, 2 European American men, 2 European American women, and 1 Haitian Canadian woman. That's 5 people. And they met with James R. Mahalik, who is the author of this paper, a European American man. These groups met every week for 90 minutes over an 8-month period to A. discuss the applicability of the norms identified in the literature, B. refine the categories of the norms, and C. construct items to assess the continuum of conformity to the norm. For example, early in the process of measure construction, Mahalik asked the group to discuss their observations of whether males in the United States actually receive normative messages from the dominant culture that have been identified in the masculinity literature, e.g., to be successful. If there was agreement among group members that a norm was distinctly applicable to men, it was set aside for the next phase. However, if there was disagreement about whether a norm was distinctly applicable to men, it was revised. For example, in discussion, the norm to be successful, women in the focus groups reported they also received messages to be successful, felt pressure to be successful, and reported that this was true for most of their female friends. It was important that masculine norms identified through this process be distinct from feminine norms because Bem, 1981, noted that there are separate social gender schemas associated with masculinity versus femininity. Specifically, she observed that adults in the child's world rarely notice or remark upon how strong a little girl is becoming or how nurturant a little boy is becoming, despite their readiness to note precisely these attributes in the, quote, appropriate sex, unquote. Thus, if a norm was seen as equally applicable to men and women, or was seen as very similar to another norm, e.g. success and performance accomplishment, the group members were given homework assignments to discuss these issues with friends and family. At the next meeting, the issues would be discussed and the idea around the norm refined until there was consensus that it reflected a masculine norm that was part of the cultural mainstream in US society. Continuing with the example above, after extensive discussion about the issues of success and accomplishment, women group members described that although they felt pressure to be successful, they did not experience expectations that they had to win at everything in which they were involved. However, Male members of the focus group reported that winning was a very salient message for them and for their male friends and family, with people reporting it as a defining message for men found in the cultural mainstream. Thus, winning was identified as a masculine norm of interest for the measure. Okay, so let's begin picking this apart. So first of all, we have a group of 9 people who are the ones who are deciding what are masculine norms in society. First of all, these are 9 people who are doing masters or are doctoral students in counseling psychology. So for people who are regulars to my content, they may remember a video I did not all that long ago, titled Progressive Academic Echo Chambers. And this was a video where I looked through a paper which looked at the political orientation of people in the soft sciences, things like sociology and psychology. And this study found a very distinct left-leaning progressive bias, and that this is a bias that has only grown over time. And with that bias has come research bias in the fields of sociology and psychology, with certain ideas becoming accepted norms when there's actually very little evidence to support them. One such example that actually came in that paper was the use of stereotypes. It was generally considered in social sciences that stereotypes are completely inaccurate and unfair and should not be given any sort of weight or credence whatsoever. And this is in line with generally left-leaning and progressive ideology. However, an openly conservative psychologist entered the field, conducted their own experimentation, and then found that actually some stereotypes do come out for a reason, and that sometimes while they might be exaggerations, they tend to be informed by people's real-life experiences. So while some may be more inaccurate than others, the existence of a stereotype does have some degree of underlying truth, as opposed to being a complete and utter fabrication based on some sort of bigotry or prejudice. So the fact that all of these people who are inventing this scale share one particular profession, in this case they all work in the social sciences, I would say puts a very good chance that there is going to be some sort of bias in these results, since it's more than likely that they probably share some degree of ideological overlap and that will go very distinctly in one direction. And at no point in this paper is that something that's accounted for or attempted to be corrected for. Furthermore, it's a group of 9 people, and it's basically 9 people examining their particular lives and saying, well, this is what I think has been expected of me in my life, therefore this is typical of masculinity. And this scale is then just being produced by subjective consensus by this group, which means there doesn't necessarily have to be that much objective evidence for a particular point. It could quite easily just come down to how persuasive you are in group discussion in getting people to agree with you. Because once consensus has been met, that means that whatever you've agreed upon is now a masculine trait. I find the fact that they are creating a scale based on really nothing more than he said, she said, to be somewhat worrying. And I'd like to bring up here the last part of that last paragraph that we looked at, talking about winning being a very salient message for the men and not so much for the women in the group. This is a pattern that could quite easily be explained by the individual choices of the people in the group. If all of the boys, when they were younger, engaged in sports and none of the girls did, then they may both be encouraged to succeed in life, but only one of those activities, the aim is to win. So the personal choices of these people could now then be being attempted to be twisted into a "this is what society expects of masculinity." And again, there appears to be no attempt to control or even account for things like this, to even address that this could be a possibility. Now, I know that some might say, oh, well, that's just proof that this is a masculine thing, that all of the boys played sport and none of the girls did. When you're dealing with a sample size of 9 people, this could just be a complete accident of selection. If you tried it with 10 random people off the street, you could end up with 5 men, all of whom are, say, dancers, singers, and painters, and a group of 5 women, all of whom are on a football team. And then that result would probably be completely switched around. Again, they've made no attempt to determine whether or not something like that has happened. Now, you might argue that, oh, well, they talked to their friends and family, that kind of stops this sort of thing from happening. Well, not really, because family shares a similar environment to you, generally, and a lot of your friends do as well. So it's quite possible that they will have the same basic biases as the people within the group. I'm sure you get the idea of how potentially unreliable this is, so we'll move on. Using this process, we identified 12 masculine norms for the CMNI. These were labeled winning, emotional control, risk-taking, violence, dominance, playboy, self-reliance, primacy of work, power over women, disdain for homosexuals, physical toughness, and pursuit of status. So let's talk about some of these traits that they've just decided are masculine. The first thing which I'd like to point out, and this is to reiterate a point that was made on the live stream, there is no comparative here for female traits. And by way of phrasing some of these, they must be male by default. For instance, playboy. No woman is going to admit to being a playboy or say that they are encouraged to be a playboy, because that is not the term that you would use for a pattern of behavior that a woman exhibits. If you took the trait playboy and translated it as being, say, sexually promiscuous, taking multiple partners, you would use different terminology for a woman. Some would call it being a slut, some would call it being sexually liberated. The very use of this language has made it a masculine trait when actually the pattern of behavior might not be. It's on the list as a point of semantics and nothing more. What's more unusual about the playboy trait is why exactly the author chose to use it. If you go back through his cited literature, and the book that Malik himself attributes to this trait, it's a book by I.M. Harris written in 1995 titled Messages Men Hear, Constructing Masculinities. When you look up what Harris was talking about when they wrote about Playboy, you find that the author asserts that this is one of 4 roles under the category of men's ways of loving. The other 3 ways in which men love, according to this author, is by being a breadwinner, by being a faithful husband, and by being a nurturer. And if you continue reading on through the book, you find that 1% of men that author surveyed chose the playboy role as being the dominant role in their way of loving. Which raises the very interesting question, why exactly did Malik pick something that only 1% of men surveyed said was relevant to them, and then try and say that this is the normalized pattern of behavior? Because on one hand you have 1%, on the other hand you have the norm. These two things are not synonyms, in fact they're pretty much direct opposites to each other. Traits like power over women and violence. These are again difficult things to objectively quantify as being norms in US society. When you're constantly bombarded with messages like, it's never acceptable to hit a girl, it's difficult to see where this comes from. If you took violence in isolation, a common sense approach to this might be to say that, yeah, in a lot of cultures it's a masculine norm to use violence when necessary, say to protect yourself or to protect someone else who is in immediate danger. But it wouldn't be considered a very masculine trait if you just went around beating up people at random, especially if the target of that violence was a woman or a child. So this category is a monumental failure to define terms correctly. So if you were to answer yes to a hypothetical statement, would you, if necessary, take part in a fight in order to, say, protect a member of your family or one of your friends from attack, and you answer in the positive, you've been categorized as normative for violence, even though violence would actually then be an extreme outlier to your normative behavior. Consider now power over women as linked to pursuit of status. These two traits are potentially the same thing. If you pursue status and you reach high status, you would necessarily have power over other people because you would be wielding more social influence. And yet they've decided to categorize it as power over women exclusively, as opposed to simply high status power over others. The language has been gendered when it doesn't need to be. If they were to attempt to develop a scale like this for women, would they include power over men? Well, as we've seen earlier in this paper, the author basically completely ignored the concept of women having any sort of agency, so I think it's fair to say that they wouldn't. If you consider modern entertainment mediums, a very common message for women is that men are useless, bumbling idiots. When you consider the portrayal of men in the media, that's basically all they seem to be. Basically, overgrown children who are incapable of taking care of themselves, leaving the woman in their life to be their better half who just effortlessly takes care of everything. Someone in such a position in reality could quite easily be considered to have power over the other, and it would be the person who is in the position of competence, which would be the woman. And yet, I can't help but think that that wouldn't be something that this author would willingly acknowledge. Honestly, given the number of problems with this scale, I would safely say that any results that have been gleaned from it cannot be trusted. And I'd like to back us up just a little bit to a slightly earlier stage in this thing's development, just to really question how accurate it is. You may remember that this was supposed to be looking at the society in the United States, specifically dealing with middle to upper class white males, because apparently their behavior influences everyone else. I'd just like to take another look at the two focus groups who then developed this scale. Out of the 9 people in the focus groups, there are 3 European American men. 1/3 of the people developing the scale that is supposed to be developed from what men are told in society, specifically white men, only 1/3 of that group is actually represented in the focus group. There are only 4 men in total and yet 5 women. Perhaps we should rename the CMNI as What Women Think Society Teaches Men to Be, because that might be a little bit of a more accurate title. As I've said, I'm not going to be looking at the results from this paper because I consider the actual methodology of this, how this scale was developed, to be so fundamentally flawed that any data gathered from it is irrelevant. Instead, what I would like to do is look at another paper that Mihalik has published, The Development of the Conformity to Feminine Norms Inventory. So he did develop a feminine norms inventory. It was just 2 years after the masculine norms inventory. Unsurprisingly, it shares a great many of the same methodological problems that the masculine norms does, except that their focus group consisted of 32 women. So the feminine scale was developed by people who it actually affects, as opposed to the masculine scale, which was also mostly developed by women. Although in the cases of the final focus groups, they were done by both men and women. And then they were finally pared down to 12 feminine norms, which were worked out to be relational, sweet and nice, thinness, put others first, look young, sexy, modesty, domestic, caring for children, romantic relationship, sexual fidelity, and to invest in appearance. Now, what I find most interesting actually about this is simply the difference in language. Consider, if you will, Playboy versus sexual fidelity. The way by which they work out whether you are strongly conforming or weakly conforming or not at all is to give you a series of statements and you then answer 1, 2, 3, or 4 on a sliding scale. And I'd just like you to consider some of the statements that they use to work this out. And I'll just put them up on the screen for you now. So the male question, Playboy from CMNI, if I could, I would frequently change sexual partners. From the feminine behavior scale, the CFNI, I frequently change sexual partners. They're basically the same statement or question. From the male, Playboy, I would only have sex if I was in a committed relationship. From the female sexual fidelity, I would only have sex if I was in a committed relationship, like a marriage. Again, it's basically the same statement or question. Just look down these statements or questions that they're asking you to answer 1, 2, 3, or 4 on that sliding scale. You'll notice they're basically the same, and yet in one paper they're calling them Playboy, and in the other they're calling them sexual fidelity. As I mentioned towards the beginning of this video, the language is loaded when you're defining the same characteristic. One of these has a much more negative connotation than the other, Sexual fidelity is generally considered to be good, whereas being a playboy is generally considered to be bad. And yet, these are the same points that they're making. They're the same questions that they are asking. And yet men get labelled playboy in this category, yes or no, and women get labelled sexual fidelity, yes or no. It's loaded language designed to make the men appear worse and the women appear better. It's two different words with two different connotations that describe the same pattern of behaviour. While we're talking about loaded language, I'd like to take us back to another point which I made earlier about the political shift in the soft sciences and how they have become more and more left-leaning over time, something which I've objectively demonstrated in other videos, and the effect that this has had on research over time. What is interesting is if you look at other papers which have attempted to define masculine behaviour in the past, you will notice a very, very distinct shift of language over time. And these papers are things which were cited in Malik's paper, the 2003 Conforming to Masculine Norms Inventory. So if you look at some of the older papers, such as Turner from the 1970s, masculinity was defined as an independent style of achievement, competency, incompetency in feminine activities, and suppressing emotion. In 1978, it was defined as being active, dominant in relationships, achievement-orientated, level-headed, and self-contained. In 1984, it was prescriptive norm against anything feminine, achieving status, independence, self-confidence, and aggressiveness. So some of these sound a bit negative, some of them are a bit neutral, and some of them sound very positive. Again, from 1986 here from Pleck, independent, assertive, strong personality, forceful, has leadership abilities, willing to take risks, willing to take a stand, aggressive. Some negative, some neutral, some positive. And you've got to remember, around the 80s was the real big hit of feminism. That's when it really started moving into academia. And then in 2003, this some negative, some neutral, some positive has descended into Malik's violence, power over women, disdain for homosexuals, risk-taking, pursuit of status, emotional control, dominance, playboy, self-reliance, primacy of work, and winning. The general shift in language is quite stark, moving from a fairly wide-ranging some negative to positive to basically entirely negative with a few that could be neutral. And I think that this really might be quite indicative of the overall cultural shift in the soft sciences that we've seen over the last few decades. So I'm going to bring this to an end and wrap us up. The development of the CMNI scale is not very good. It is a very questionable metric to be using as a means of finding out any sort of data or doing any sort of analysis on any particular population. And this owes to the very questionable way in which it was produced. It's a scale that's supposed to be examining middle to upper class masculinity, which is then not masculinity as a whole. This comes about because the author asserts that middle and upper class white men influence the behavior of everyone else. These patterns of behavior were majoritarily defined by women. Many of the behaviors that are listed on the CMNI are not gendered behaviors in any capacity at all. They are simply asserted to be gendered. And when compared to the conformity to feminine norms inventory, you find the exact same behavior being questioned, but then being titled a different thing. And it really does appear to be because of a pro-female, anti-male bias from the people developing these. They do seem to have a very distinct direction that they want this research to go in. The problem with using any sort of meta-analysis that has used the CNMI or the CFNI as a means of gathering data is that it's going to fall into the typical trap that some meta-analyses do. While meta-analyses are very useful tools, if all the data gathered from multiple studies is bad, then the meta-analysis is going to provide bad data while not pointing out how the data is bad. Meta-analyses have a wonderful ability of bringing a lot of good stuff out of a lot of bad things, because all the problems in methodology in the dozen or so papers that the meta-analysis is constructed from, they get left in the individual papers and are never addressed by the meta-analysis, because the meta-analysis is just pulling the results out of those papers. If the results were gleaned from terrible methodology, then they're bad results. They're worthless. But the meta-analysis doesn't then make any allowance for that because it's only looking at the results and drawing conclusions from those results. So I would say anyone who is using results from a meta-analysis that was gathered from studies using the CMNI or even the CFNI is using some very questionable and potentially highly faulty data, and thus any conclusions drawn from said data is also very questionable and frankly should probably be ignored until these problems with the actual CMNI are corrected, or a new scale that actually works is developed.